The press conference was supposed to be routine. A standard pre-tournament media availability, questions about preparation, about the roster, about Japan's chances against Venezuela. The kind of session that generates polite headlines and fills 30 seconds of a sports broadcast before the highlights. Then Shohei Ohtani said 3 words that detonated across 2 continents simultaneously. It's not impossible. 4 syllables. Delivered in Ohtani's characteristic quiet, no theater, no dramatic pause, no awareness that he was about to set the American sports media landscape on fire. He said it the way he says everything consequential. Calmly. Directly. With the particular stillness of a man who has already thought through every implication of what he is about to say and decided that honesty is the only language worth speaking. The room took approximately 3 seconds to process what had just happened. Then every reporter reached for their phone simultaneously. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. ESPN. MLB Network. Sports talk radio from New York to Los Angeles. Former players and current analysts interrupting scheduled programming to respond to a statement so unexpected, so loaded with possibility and implication, that the American baseball world simply could not process it quietly. Shohei Ohtani had just suggested, carefully, conditionally, but unmistakably, that a limited WBC appearance was on the table. And nothing about the conversation around Japan versus Venezuela, around Samurai Japan's tournament chances, around the entire landscape of this WBC, would ever be quite the same again. To understand the magnitude of what Ohtani said, you need to understand what everyone thought they already knew going into that press conference. The established narrative, built carefully over weeks of measured communications from the Dodgers organization, from Samurai Japan's medical staff, from the quiet but consistent messaging coming out of the Japanese Baseball Federation, was that Ohtani's role in this WBC would be defined and limited by his physical condition. That the priority was his long-term health. That the Dodgers' enormous investment and Ohtani's own extraordinary career trajectory demanded a cautious, conservative approach to his involvement. Nobody disputed this framework. It was presented as responsible. As obvious. As the only sensible way to approach the situation. Ohtani had other thoughts. The specific question that produced the 3-word answer came from a Japanese reporter who asked, with careful indirectness, whether there was any scenario in which Ohtani might take the field during the tournament, not in a full starting capacity, but in some limited, defined role that balanced competitive contribution against physical caution. The room expected the answer everyone had been trained to expect. A gentle deflection. A reference to the medical team's guidance. A smile and a pivot toward discussing the roster's overall strength. Instead, Ohtani looked at the reporter, considered the question for exactly the length of time it takes a man to decide to be honest, and said, "It's not impossible." Then he kept talking, qualifying, contextualizing, explaining the conditions and uncertainties that surrounded any such possibility. But the qualifications landed on ears that had already locked onto 3 words and would not release them. It's not impossible. The speed with which Ohtani's statement crossed the Pacific and detonated inside American sports media was itself a kind of testament to his cultural reach, to the appetite for anything Ohtani-related that has built steadily in the United States since his arrival in MLB, and to the specific electricity that surrounds any suggestion that the impossible might not be impossible after all. ESPN's baseball coverage interrupted its scheduled programming within 20 minutes of the clip circulating. The cheerin that appeared on screen, Ohtani, limited WBC appearance, not impossible, was simple enough, but the studio's reaction to it was anything but simple. The anchors, the analysts, the former players assembled around the desk, men who have covered and played baseball at the highest level for decades, responded with a mixture of disbelief and something that can only be described as reverence. Because they understood, immediately and completely, what it meant for a player managing the physical situation Ohtani was managing to sit in front of a microphone and use those words. It's not impossible. That is not the language of a player going through the motions of national team participation while privately prioritizing his club season. That is the language of a competitor who has looked at his physical condition honestly, looked at the opportunity in front of him honestly, and refused to close a door that he is not yet certain needs to be closed. MLB Network's coverage went deeper. A panel that included 3 former All-Stars spent nearly 40 minutes dissecting not just what Ohtani said but what it revealed about his psychology, about the particular competitive wiring that makes him incapable of the comfortable, career-protecting answer that virtually every other player in his situation would have delivered without hesitation. One former pitcher on the panel, a man who had competed in international baseball himself and understood the specific gravity of a WBC moment, put it most directly. He said, "Not impossible," because he meant, "not impossible," he said. There's no spin there. That's just who he is. The American media explosion around Ohtani's statement quickly drew in voices that carried specific weight, former players whose opinions about baseball greatness come anchored in the credibility of their own extraordinary careers. What emerged from those conversations, across multiple platforms and multiple days of coverage, was a consensus that was both surprising in its unanimity and completely logical once you understood the baseball minds producing it. They were not surprised. Not really. Derek Jeter, speaking on a podcast appearance that was immediately clipped and redistributed across baseball's social media, framed his response around the concept of competitive identity. "There are players who compete until they can't," he said. "And then there are players who redefine what can't means every single day. Ohtani is the second kind." Jeter's point, that Ohtani's statement reflected not recklessness but a fundamentally different relationship with physical limitation than most players possess, was echoed across the spectrum of former player commentary. The specific details varied. The underlying assessment was consistent. Pedro Martinez, whose own career was defined by the coexistence of extraordinary physical gifts and a competitor's refusal to acknowledge limitation, went further. He described Ohtani's 3 words as the most honest thing said in a WBC press conference in the history of this tournament. Not because the content was dramatic, but because the alternative, the safe, managed, career-protecting deflection, was so clearly available and so clearly rejected. He could have said anything else, Martinez noted. He said what was true. That's rarer than people think. Alex Rodriguez, analyzing the statement from the perspective of someone who spent his own career navigating the intersection of physical condition and competitive ambition, focused on what Ohtani's words meant for Japan's opponents. "Every team in this tournament just got a little more nervous," he said. "Because now they have to prepare for the possibility that he's actually out there. You can't ignore that. You can't game plan around not impossible." This was the dimension of the story that American analysis kept returning to, the competitive ripple effect of Ohtani's statement on every other team in the tournament. Because, "it's not impossible," doesn't just describe Ohtani's own situation. It changes the psychological landscape for Venezuela, for Team USA, for every roster that has built its approach to this WBC around a particular assumption about what Japan's lineup would look like. That assumption is no longer reliable. The Japan vs. Venezuela game had already been circled as one of the tournament's most anticipated matchups before Ohtani said anything. Venezuela's roster, deep, experienced, anchored by major league talent that rivals any national team outside of Japan and the United States, was considered by many analysts to be the most complete test Japan would face in the early rounds. Venezuela's coaching staff had prepared accordingly. Detailed scouting. Pitching strategies calibrated to Japan's lineup tendencies. Defensive alignments built around the specific threats that Samurai Japan's most dangerous hitters posed. And then Ohtani said 3 words, and every piece of that preparation acquired a new layer of uncertainty. Sources familiar with Venezuela's camp described the response to Ohtani's statement as measured publicly and considerably less measured privately. The coaching staff, by all accounts, immediately began running contingency scenarios, adjustments to their pitching plan that accounted for the possibility, however conditional, of facing Ohtani in some capacity. One Venezuelan player, speaking anonymously to a reporter covering the team's preparation, captured the psychological reality succinctly. "You prepare for a team," he said. And then the best player in the world says he might be there after all. How do you prepare for that? The honest answer is that you don't. Not fully. You make adjustments, you run your scenarios, you tell yourself and your teammates that preparation covers all possibilities. But the specific anxiety of facing Shohei Ohtani, even a limited, physically constrained Shohei Ohtani, is not something that preparation entirely neutralizes. Venezuela knows this. Their response to, "It's not impossible," was not panic. But it was not calm either. It was the particular focused alertness of a very good team that has just been reminded, unexpectedly, that the competitive landscape they had mapped so carefully might look different when the game actually begins. Step back from the tournament logistics, from the pitching matchups and lineup calculations and managerial strategy, and what Ohtani's statement reveals is something more fundamental about who he is and how he understands his relationship with baseball. He could have protected himself with language. Every PR apparatus around him, the Dodgers communications team, the Japanese Baseball Federation's media management, his own carefully cultivated public persona, provided him with endless softer, safer formulations. "We're taking it day by day. The medical team will guide the decision. My priority is being healthy for the full season." All of those sentences are available. All of them are defensible. None of them are lies. Ohtani chose none of them. He chose honesty. The specific, unprotected honesty of a competitor who will not close a door that his body has not yet closed for him. Who will not tell the world he is unavailable when unavailable is not yet the accurate word. Who understands, at a level that seems almost philosophical, that the integrity of his competitive identity matters more than the comfort of a managed narrative. This is what Dave Roberts saw when he flew to Japan to check on him personally. This is what Aaron Judge was responding to when he said, "No more excuses." This is what manager Ibata navigates every morning at practice, the reality of coaching a player whose relationship with competition is so fundamental to his identity that even physical limitation cannot entirely contain it. "It's not impossible" is not a medical assessment. It is a self-portrait. The Japan vs. Venezuela game will be decided by pitching and defense and situational hitting and the 10,000 small competitive moments that accumulate across 9 innings into a final score. Ohtani's presence or absence in the lineup will matter enormously in practical terms, in the matchup mathematics, in the psychological weight his name carries when it appears on a lineup card. But what has already happened, what cannot be undone by whatever the medical staff and the managers ultimately decide, is the statement itself. 3 words, delivered quietly in a press conference room, that traveled across the Pacific in minutes and landed in the American baseball conversation with the force of something much larger than 3 words should carry. Because what those words said, underneath the tournament logistics and the injury management and the competitive strategy, is something simple and extraordinary. Shohei Ohtani is not ready to be absent. Not from this tournament, not from this moment, not from the opportunity to stand on a field wearing his country's uniform and compete at the level that defines everything he has built since those early mornings at Hanamaki Higashi High School when a teenager decided, quietly and completely, that there was no version of his life that did not involve being the best. It's not impossible. 3 words. 1 self-portrait. And a baseball world that will not stop talking about it until the game actually begins, and possibly long after. The press conference ended. The reporters filed their stories. The American media ran the clip until it became part of the tournament's permanent soundtrack. And somewhere in a Samurai Japan training facility, Shohei Ohtani went back to his preparation, the boiled eggs, the precise nutrition, the mechanical work, the routine that never stops, because for him, the words were never the point. The point is always what comes next.